Will the COVID recession be followed by an economic depression? We asked Professor David Blanchflower what can be done. Will the American presidential election affect the economic outcome for America and the rest of the world? And Alec Neil, member of the Scottish Parliament, Robin McAlpine, convener of the think tank Commonweal. Will new economic thinking emerge to meet the COVID crisis? Join us on the Alex Salmond Show, on air and online.
Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show and to an examination of the economics of recovery from the COVID crisis. The world is in recession, but the impact globally from region to region has been very different. The UK is heading for a 10% decline in GDP, while the world average is perhaps 5%. Meanwhile, in Asia, where the pandemic began, the GDP fall will be less than 1%. Where the GDP leads, unemployment will surely follow. In today's show, we asked Professor Danny Blanchflower, a former member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, whether the OECD economies are doing enough to avoid the coronavirus recession running into a COVID depression. And ask this leading international economist what impact the presidential election will have on the economic outlook. But first to Alex with your tweets, messages and emails.
Now, last week's show on the Democrat campaign in America and President Trump in and out of hospital provoked a lot of interest. Andrew Northwell says, really enjoyed both interviews, fascinating and informative. Looks like Biden still has a mountain to climb to win, but agree that Kamala Harris is seriously impressive. And RB says, in general, I enjoy your show. Unfortunately, I did not enjoy this show. It's surprising how you and your guests were so one-sided against Trump. Well, I'd say in our defence, RB, that we had a show a month or two back on the Republicans, with Republican commentators. Last week's show was about the Democrat campaign, so obviously they were less favourable to President Trump than the Republican commentators were. And Isabel says, Mary Cunningham, because there was a debate about Trump going in a hospital, he should have saved money and stayed home since his symptoms were mild. He is the president, after all, and can do as he pleases. So why go to hospital? And following up on this point, Anne says he either never had it and staged this, or he has it and does not care. As long as, and she says, President Trump's attitude is, I am all right. I am the best all right I have ever been. And Ed says to Anne that steroids make you feel brand new. But Mary Cunningham comes to President Trump's defence. She says, I know 3 people who tested positive for COVID and 2 were asymptomatic. And the other, my partner, had a cough for 2 days. I'm not a Trump fan, but accusing him of faking it without evidence is very odd to me. Jan says, Trump says all Americans should receive the same treatment he had. That's going to take a phenomenal amount of movie producers, production crew and helicopters. Thomas says, is he not going to give this drug cocktail free to the American people? Lee says, I'm curious, but can the President of America be used as a guinea pig for untested medical research? If anyone knows, please, can you let me know? And Max is a strong defender of the President. He says Trump became president, broke records in a short time. He created millions of jobs and unemployment at record lows. He reduced taxes and wages increased. Trump is one of the greats. Yet the super rich fear him, so they want to paint a bad picture. Why else would he be up for 3 Peace Awards? Norma says, I was watching CNN and a commentator said Trump would come to Scotland when he loses. I was screaming at the television, we don't want him either. Tracy says, you don't speak for everyone. Some of us support him, actually. But Bob says, the world needs to distance itself from America before they pull other countries down the toilet with them. This is why there are so many people in America whose heads are spinning just now. And now back to Tasmina.
In April, we asked Professor David Blanchflower for his assessment on the measures required to stave off a world recession. This is what he had to say then.
In 2008, the world was unprepared for a financial crisis. In 2020, they were unprepared for basically a health crisis. And so now we're playing catch up. And all the responses that we've seen, which I said were exemplary, but they're not going to be enough. They're probably going to have to do the same thing next month and the month afterwards. And so the things that we're seeing are unthinkable, is that over this decade or so, the world and policymakers have been utterly unprepared.
Today, he joins Alex to assess the impact to date on the United States and world economies and give his views on the economic consequences of President Trump and challenger Joe Biden.
And Professor David Blanchford joins me from Florida. Welcome back to the show, Danny.
Good to speak to you again, of course.
Now, what about the economic policy response in America? I mean, when I last spoke to you on this show, you were pretty complimentary about the big guns being trained on the impact of the pandemic. Are you still satisfied that the immediate policy response has been up to the task?
Well, it was really very good from around March at the lockdown. A huge response, central bank, Congress all together. And then, as often is the way with these things, the initial enthusiasm died away, and the unemployment benefits that the Congress was paying out stopped at the end of July. And basically, the economy has now started to slow because the stimulus has been pulled back, and the economy is slowing. And I think it's actually impacting the polls, and it's impacting Republicans, and it's impacting Donald Trump's position in the polls. So the answer is bad there. And in the UK context, we saw good response. And now we're seeing the Chancellor flailing around. And today we started to see unemployment rates coming up. And I suspect we're going to see the same thing in the UK. So initially good, and now they've got cold feet, and we're seeing slowing as the pandemic spreads again.
Now, you were one of the most trenchant critics of the economics of austerity and after the Great Recession of 2009-10. But isn't there a different perspective, a bigger opportunity now? Because borrowing rates are so low or non-existent. What exactly is the constraint, the fiscal constraint, that so many governments seem to be handcuffing themselves, putting themselves in manacles, as opposed to taking the opportunity of these incredibly low borrowing rates to get the job done?
What we've seen in the United States is a tax giveaway, which raised the deficit and raised the debt by $2 trillion. So I think it's hard to argue that you care that much in these times about the debt. So I agree with you that borrowing is a completely sensible thing to do. Perhaps what we should focus on is not so much how much should you borrow. The question is, what should you spend it on? And I remember talking to you when you were first minister, and you thought a lot about what can we do about shovel-ready projects? Can we actually start things and invest in things? And it was about build hospitals, build schools, build roads, build sensible things to get the economy going and quickly. So the answer is, you can borrow cheaply, go do it.
In economic policy terms, what difference would a President Biden make compared to a President Trump?
I think you're going to see a series of things. I mean, the first thing you're going to see on international things is that Biden on day one will rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. You'll see a bigger push in terms of helping people in clean energy and all of that kind of stuff. But I think what you're going to see is a steady way forward, investment in jobs, try especially to protect the Affordable Care Act. But I don't think you're going to see anything huge, partly because Biden has reassured the markets and has actually said, I mean, the big economic policy, Alex, is that they're going to reverse those tax increases, and they're basically going to promise they will do nothing to the vast majority of people who earn under $400,000 a year. And I think the reason, in a sense, is that those tax cuts really have shown it's hard to see any major economic benefits. You just changed income inequality and wealth inequality. You just moved money to the rich. So I think that's the big thing you're going to see. But I think increasingly, there is not going to be a giant change because they've reassured the markets. And basically, they're going to move to job creation, especially in climate change areas.
Now, the lesson of economic crisis is that it does provoke new economic thinking. I mean, Keynesianism was, to a large extent, new economic thinking caused by the Great Depression. But it often takes a bit of a time for it to to become translated into economic policy. Orthodoxy seems to have a stranglehold, and we saw that again in 2009-10. What are your hopes this time round, with a serious economic crisis following the pandemic, that new economic thinking will be translated into new economic policy?
Well, I think that's a really great question. I mean, you have to look forward and think, well, what have we learned from the pandemic? In America, the crucial distinction is the Republicans are going to the Supreme Court a week after the election with 20 attorneys generals to tear down the Affordable Care Act. And the question is, 75% of the people support it. What are you going to do? Are you going to remove that and replace it with nothing? So I think going forward, these kinds of battles about care, health insurance, how you deal with the low end are the crucial thing. And I think the other question is going to be, what the heck are you going to do about the young? In Scotland, it's a big issue. In England, it's an issue. And in America, it's a giant issue.
What would be your advice to governments around the world in order to get new economic thinking translated into policy action?
Well, I think there's two parts to it, Alex, and I'm a student of history as you are. I mean, the first thing is that when the boat's sinking and the people are in the water, the priority is to save them, save the economy and build it, and then start to plan for the future. And I've thought a lot about this. In fact, in 1943, in the midst of the Second World War, Winston Churchill got an economist, William Beveridge, to actually write about, write about what are we going to do when the troops come home? What are we going to do when the women who worked in the factories, what are we going to do about them when they come home? And this great work that he did talked about establishing a welfare state, thinking about how we run an economy so that there are decent jobs for people. So it's that kind of thinking, strategic, long-term thinking. I mean, it's a bit like, what are you going to do when the troops come home? And the answer is, you're going to have to start to build a society for everybody. You're going to have to start to deal with the left behind. It's about find good jobs for people.
So I'm going to get you to take your crystal ball out and put your textbook away for a second. Now, I've had to push you on whether you think the policy response internationally is going to be like the new economic order which followed the cataclysm of the Second World War, or is it going to be the underachievement and underperformance that followed the Great Recession of 2009-10? Are we going to get a new way in economics, or are we going to be stuck in the ruts of the past?
Well, my heart hopes that it will be kind and gentle and positive, but my head tells me that it will be much like we saw in the Great Recession, where George Osborne comes in, imposes austerity and says, we're all in this together, which is precisely, that was precisely not true. And so the question is, once we're through this pandemic and we're through this phase, will it be kind of back to the old order? I don't know. I mean, I do think, Alex, that perhaps what's different this time is that this pandemic will change people's behavior in the long term. I mean, the Great Recession didn't. It was back to normal pretty quickly. But I think think about what old people are doing. I mean, in America, the big thing with Trump in 2016 was the old people were with him. Today, they're not. He says, go out, come to a rally, go to the store, and their doctors are telling them not to. So the question is there a long-run change in behavior? And if there is, then there's hope, I think, that we'll see fundamental change.
And Danny, when you're holding your Zoom tutorials at the present moment with the students at Dartmouth College, what is the question that they're asking you about contemporary economic policy? What is the thing they're saying, Professor Blanchfleur? Can you tell us why this is happening or not happening?
Well, that's a great question. I think the big question that they're asking right now is what the heck is going on? I think, Alex, it's about, can you think of new ways of working out what's going on, but especially what's coming? I mean, what the heck is coming? And I think that's what they're trying to work on, and that's hard. But this is exciting times, and hopefully, this will actually prove to be positive. But it's hard to see that in the darkness of a storm.
Professor David Blanchfleur, thank you again for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Now join us after the break, where we turn the economic focus from the American election to the next election scheduled in the UK for the Scottish Parliament and the National Assembly of Wales. Join us then.
Welcome back. The next elections scheduled in the UK are in Scotland and Wales next year. The polls will be dominated by COVID-19 and its consequences. The economic circumstances are likely to be dire, but is new thinking coming forward to meet the scale of the challenge? Alex is in conversation with former Cabinet Minister Alex Neil, MSP, and Robin McAlpine, Director of the Scottish think tank Commonweal.
Welcome to the show, Alec and Robin.
Pleasure.
Hi.
Alec Neil, you're a former Cabinet Minister, but you're in the backbenches now in the Scots Parliament, but you've recently published an economic plan for recovery. Now, we're clearly in a great health emergency, which is going to be accompanied by a huge economic emergency. What's your plan consist of, and what's the chances of it being brought forward into action?
Well, the first objective, Alec, is to make sure we all survive through the pandemic, whether it's individuals or businesses. So the number one priority is emergency funding for businesses and for individuals to make sure people don't end up in dire poverty as a result of the pandemic. Secondly, we then need a plan to deal with the tsunami of unemployment that's very clearly coming throughout Scotland and indeed the rest of the United Kingdom, Wales and Northern Ireland, as well as England. And I think that needs a number of things to happen. Number one, we need to keep the social security improvements to make sure the spending powers in the economy at local levels. Secondly, we need an investment programme in infrastructure. And thirdly, we need a massive investment programme also in business investment, R&D, business infrastructure for the longer term. And I think if we do all of these things together, then we have a good chance of minimising the impact in terms of unemployment, but also surviving the pandemic so we've got an economy to go back to once the pandemic's over.
Robin McAlpine, you convene the think tank Commonweal, which publishes an impressive range of policies and all sorts of subjects. Do crises such as this actually provoke new thinking in terms of economic and other policies?
Well, not straight away. One of the things that I think we're seeing at the moment is everybody fights the last war. And so we fight the last war. We're fighting this as if it's a normal crisis, it's a normal economic problem. And we try that for a while. Then we discover it's not working. And that's when we start to move into a new economics. And really what I'm hoping is that we can move that process along as fast as we can, not just in Scotland, but globally. We have to understand that the tools that we used to try and deal with the 2009 financial crisis didn't really work then, certainly not in the long term. And we're basically trying to just use them again just now. And it won't be, I fear, until we realise that's not working, until someone says, but hold on a second, what are we going to actually try? What's going to actually work? We will come out of this at the end with a very different economics than the ones that we were using when we went into it. But the question is whether we are forced into a change or whether we recognise that that change is coming. I hope we recognise it sooner rather than later.
So, Rob McAlpine, when you say you fight the last war in economic terms, are you saying that the prolonged period of austerity which followed the Great Recession of 2009, are we in danger of another 10 years of austerity following the great pandemic of 2020?
This is not 2009. This is much more like the brutal restructuring that our economies went through in the 1980s, certainly in Britain. So it's more fundamental than just we're going to have austerity. It's going to be there are entire industry sectors which we have assumed will always be with us in the form in which they're with us. And they're not going to be like that in the future. And again, the question is, do we realise this change is coming and shape it? Or do we pretend this change isn't coming and then panic when it arrives?
Now, Alec Neil, if I had to ask you to put your finger on one aspect of the recovery programme that you've put forward, which can both be an immediate, at least palliative to the economic problems and bring about long-term restructuring, what would it be in your programme?
There's a lot of mythology around the national debt and the deficit. 40% of the £2 trillion national debt is actually owned by the Bank of England, i.e. by the government. So the government can actually borrow a lot more to jumpstart the economy, to see us through to survival and maintain the capacity. And at the end of the day, it's not paying any interest on that money. It never needs to repay that money because it's to itself. And there's no chance of it causing inflation. So there's more borrowing capacity in terms of printing money by the Bank of England through various techniques.
Now, Robin McAlpine, a Commonweal, I've read much of the material. It's fascinating stuff. But as a think tank, what chances have you got of getting some of your ideas taken forward as policy? I mean, after all, government, understandably, to some extent, is totally immersed in the health crisis at the present moment. It's very difficult to pick up some of the blue sky thinking from Commonweal. So what are the chances of parts of your ideas coming forward as a programme?
What I would really like to see happen is the concept of a Green New Deal incubator. If I could choose one radical thing to get going with, it's to say, we'd already done a piece of work on how you would do a full Green New Deal for Scotland. It's actually the first comprehensive costed Green New Deal anywhere in the world. And one of the big problems is that it takes a while to get going. So it takes 3-4 years of lead time before you can actually really do anything, which is a full parliamentary term. And we've got this problem whereby the biggest barrier to a Green New Deal, which people have got to understand is really just a big engineering project, was lack of people. There wasn't enough people trained in the kind of skill sets that we needed. And so what I'd really like to push is, we've got this human capacity. We've got this giant global environmental need to do something. You can do all of this in ways which are highly enterprising, create jobs, and really, really start to move you forward, both in terms of reindustrialization, but also in terms of actually getting people into good, well-paid jobs. Will we grasp this and say, with some vision, we're going to go and do this? There's no sign of that happening just now. And that really is something that we're going to look back on and say, my God, why didn't we do something 6 months ago?
Well, finally, guys, the elections next year in Scotland and indeed in Wales, will they actually help some of this new thinking to come forward? Will they concentrate the minds as the election approaches on the various parties? Or will the only show in town really be COVID and the pandemic and squeeze out the thinking for the future? What do you think, Alec Neil? You've been through a few elections yourself.
Absolutely. I think there's going to be 3 issues, all of which are complementary to each other. One is where we're at with the pandemic. Secondly, how do we deal with the huge backlog in the National Health Service that will be there by then? And the other one, which is of equal importance to the other two, is how do we deal with the unemployment level and the tsunami that will have hit us by then? And these 3 things are all important because we've got to operate on all 3 fronts simultaneously. And what I would do is I would run a training and employment grant scheme for small and medium-sized businesses to get people into work and into training immediately. And I would give a very heavy longer-term subsidy on wages and training costs over the next 2 or 3 years, so that you build that bridge between coming out of the pandemic and getting back into normal times. And if you don't build the bridge, the problem's going to get a lot worse before it can get better. So those are going to be the 3 priorities. And I think the election, both in Wales and in Scotland, is going to be determined largely by how people and the parties respond to the pandemic, the NHS backlog, the economy, and in particular, unemployment and business failures.
So Robin McAlpine, Commonweal, a think tank, and independence is still the big fault line in Scottish politics. But let's just say, for example, that the Scottish Conservatives, great opponents of independence, were suddenly to say, see that Commonweal, we like one of their policies, we'll adopt it in our programme. Would Commonweal welcome that? Would that be something you would embrace? Or would you say, beware of Conservatives bearing gifts?
We'll absolutely work with anybody. But I think you're right. The slight problem that we've got is that everything in Scotland at the moment is still stuck with this independence or not divide. And because of the scale of this crisis, and because everyone realises that some sort of big action is necessary, there's clear evidence in a number of political parties, even the Scottish Labour Party is doing better policy thinking now than it's been doing for ages. There's lots happening in the Scottish Greens. The SNP's membership is talking about these issues all over the place just now. And so what I'm kind of hoping for is that I don't expect the political leadership to lead us into radical ideas during this campaign, but I actually think there's a large public appetite and a very strong interest at the grassroots of the various political parties to say, come on, it's time we did something different here. Somewhere in the world, somewhere, is going to be the country that gets its spine about it, gets some courage and gets some bravery about itself, realises the scale of what we're going to do and is going to try something. And that country, whatever that country is, in years to come, we are going to talk about that country model, the something model. It was the country that didn't bottle it, the country that didn't hide, the country that didn't crawl into its cupboard and just say, let's do what everyone else is doing. And someone's going to get that right. And history's going to remember that that country is the country that led others towards that direction. I passionately wish it was Scotland. I have some minor hopes that it could possibly be Wales. But if it's not there, I'll be peeling my eyes to the rest of the world because somebody's going to lead us out of this. Eventually, someone's going to lead us out of this. And I can tell you that as someone who's supporting radical action, I am ready to be led by anybody that looks like they've got a clue.
Now, Alec Neil, finally, on a personal note, long-standing campaigner for independence, you're retiring at the election, that's your plan. Will you be standing on the sidelines, cheering on the independence cause? Will you be contributing to the debate? Will you be itching to get back into the battle? Very briefly, how are you going to translate from being a participant in every election to being a bystander?
Well, I'm standing down from the Parliament, but I'm not retiring, Alec. I intend to be very active in a whole range of things, not least campaigning for independence, because the pandemic, I think, has shown up why we need to be independent. For example, it would have been a lot better if we were able to have started the lockdown much earlier than we did. We couldn't do that because we don't have control over the financial levers. The things we've been talking about today, we can only do those if we've got the powers of being an independent country. So at the end of the day, independence for me remains the #1 objective. And although I'll be in a different role, I'll still be working for independence.
Alec Neil, MSP, Robin McAlpine, thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Many governments, particularly in the West, are still struggling with the balance between the health consequences of suppressing COVID and the impact of the contagion itself. Over the course of this winter, there'll be an increasing focus on the economy as the full impact of progressive lockdowns becomes apparent and the bills which have been accumulated come thudding through the fiscal letterbox. The American election will determine a great deal about the social direction of a deeply polarised society. It is less clear that it will present a significant economic shift in direction. The impact on the world economy may rather lie in the approach of America to world economic institutions and, of course, trade deals. Economic orthodoxy after the Great Depression of the 1930s meant that it took a looming world war to direct the leading economies back to full capacity. Similarly, after the Great Recession of 2009, overcautious economic policy produced a decade of austerity and falling living standards in many large countries. However, tough times certainly provoke new thinking in economies large and small. The question is, how quickly does creative thought translate into policy action? The answer will determine locally and globally whether the world emerges blinking into post-COVID sunlight or whether the blight of a pandemic is replaced by a prolonged economic darkness. But for now, from myself, Alex, and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you all again next week.